Hey everybody, welcome back to Panic to Peace. This is our community where usually Emily is the one going through just different steps of anxiety recovery, dealing with that heightened nervous system. This is not Emily, as you probably noticed. This is her husband, BG. And one thing that we are really going to try to start doing some more is putting out some content where we are directly tying the Bible into anxiety recovery, what that looks like. So what we're going to do in this new series is really dive into just some of the most popular anxiety verses, if you will. I'm sure you can find a whole list of them if you just go to Google and you look up anxiety Bible verses. So this series is a place where we're going to do that. We're going to go just kind of one by one. We'll dig into some of them, see what they really say, see how sometimes they're used a little bit out of context, and they may not mean exactly what you think they mean, or they may not be exactly how somebody else is kind of telling it to you. So what we are going to do this week is dive into Philippians. We are going to look at Philippians 4:6 specifically. First, we're going to dive into some of the context, what the book is about, who it's written to, right? Dig into all that stuff and really figure out what it means when it says, do not be anxious about anything. So one kind of disclaimer that we want to get to right away. We know when we talk about anxiety, there's a lot of different ways that people use the word nowadays. What we are dealing with in this series is mainly going to deal with the mental aspect of anxiety, right? Those thought patterns, ruminations, all that kind of stuff. We know with that comes the heightened nervous system, the physical symptoms, all of that fun stuff that some of you are dealing with. These verses aren't really dealing with the physical aspects as much, right? Emily has tons of awesome videos about all of that stuff. What we really want to do with this is dig into the root, right? How do we heal our thought processes? How do we change the way that we're thinking? How do we get more in line with what the Bible wants us to think like? And then from there, we will really see how, changing our thought patterns is going to desensitize our nervous system over time. So we're going to dig into that in just a second. So before we dive into the end of the letter, because that's where we see the do not be anxious for anything, what we're going to do is look at the rest of the letter to figure out what Paul is talking about by the end of the letter. So right away, just a quick overview here. Right away, we're going to see that Paul and Timothy are writing to the church at Philippi. We get some life updates here as we look at kind of the beginning of chapter 1. And then towards the end of chapter 1, we move into the meat and potatoes. So if we look here, starting with verse 27 and then moving in through chapters 2 and 3, it's really a couple things. So we're looking at a call for unity. Remember the early church, there was a lot of persecution for this one whole church being in Philippi. There's really this call, we see it in verse 27 and 28. We see this call to be united, right? Stand against the people that are trying to frighten you. Stick together, be one in spirit. And then we see also the call for humility. So we see a call for unity, we see a call for humility. Beginning in chapter 2, verse 5, we see this Paul saying, have the same mindset as Christ. Well, what does that mean? We can see in this case, Paul's really talking about humility, right? Living in humble obedience to God, just as Jesus did. In verse 5, have the same mindset as Christ. Verse 7, he made himself nothing. Verse 8, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Then as we move into chapter 3, this is where he's really trying to hammer home, stick to the gospel that we brought you, right? Don't worry about the teachings that some of these teachers nowadays want you to think. What we're really trying to do here is hammer home this gospel by faith, salvation by faith. It's not about the works that you have to do. So right here in verse 2, watch out for those dogs, those evildoers, those mutilators of the flesh. This is saying, forget about the teachings, forget about the other people that are trying to come in and twist the gospel I gave you. It's all about faith. And right away we see in verse 3, put no confidence in your flesh. So what does that mean? It's not about your works. It's not about being a quote unquote good enough person. Jesus did it all, guys. He paid the price for us. There is nothing else that we can add to that. If we think that we can add anything to Jesus dying on a cross for our sakes, then we miss the mark. It's all about just being in that humble obedience, living our life by faith through Jesus. So Paul's just reminding the church at Philippi of that. And sometimes we need the same reminder, right? It's very easy to kind of burden ourselves thinking that we have to live in this good enough way. And yes, we want to live a life like Jesus did, but we're all going to fall short. We can't get too caught up in that. So Paul then says in verses 8 and 9, everything that he's done that's apart from Christ, he considers a loss, right? The only thing that he considers gain is living that life worthy of him. He's not worried about having a righteousness of his own that comes from the law. So what that means is he's not worried about trying to do good enough. He knows that he will never be good enough. But he says he's trying to obtain a righteousness which is through faith in Christ. So remember, when he says righteousness, what he's talking about is just that right standing with God. Essentially it boils down to salvation. Our salvation does not come from our works, anything that we can do on our own. But he's saying it all comes through faith in Christ. And so that's some good news for us, right? We will never be good enough. We can't be good enough. But what we can do is put our faith in Jesus. So from there, we are going to dive into chapter 4, especially verses 4 through 9. And we're going to see what Paul says when he says, do not be anxious about anything. All right, so we're going to dive into verse 6 here in just a second. But first, let's see what kind of all of chapter 4 is doing. And then we'll see what that one specific section is showing. So as we move into the close of the letter, right, chapter 4 is the last chapter in this book, the last section of his letter. He has one more call for unity. So we see this specific example about the church in Philippi, how they can have unity. And then we see these final exhortations. So Paul is really urging the church to do something. What is he urging us to do? So we can see in purple here, we got rejoice, right? We say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. Do not be anxious about anything. We're coming back to that. And then by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. The peace of God will transcend all understanding and guard your hearts and minds. And then again, towards the end of this, we see think about such things. So you can see here, what are these things? Well, it's things that are true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy, all good things. And then, of course, verse 9, sometimes this is the part that is really easy to forget, and maybe the part that we need the most practice with, but it's putting it into practice, right? It's great to study all these things. It's right to acknowledge that we do need to change the way we think. It's great to acknowledge that we do need to be less anxious. But unless we're putting it into practice, the peace, the benefits that God is trying to give us, and the benefits that Paul is trying to tell us about, we're not going to see those things on our end. So right away, if we look, verse 6 is not meant to be read kind of by itself. So if anybody just says, "Oh, don't be anxious about anything," it's like, well, great, but how do I do that? And I know for so many of us, probably everybody to some extent, it's just to what extent, but everybody has anxious thoughts, right? Everybody has anxious feelings. Kind of the difference that we see with extreme anxiety is what it does is essentially it sets off your nervous system. It pulls the fire alarm and says, hey, there's an issue here. We're always anxious. You enter this perpetual state of fight or flight. So don't be anxious. Great. But how do we do it? Well, luckily, Paul gave us the rest of the instructions, right? Do not be anxious is great, but what else do we need to do? How do we do that? So right away, you say rejoice. And he even emphasizes it again, rejoice. And he says that multiple times throughout the letter. This is a letter of good news. He's trying to tell them that there is good news, right? Jesus is coming back. He's paid the price for us. You do not have to live this life where you feel you're burdened by all these laws and rules and regulations that you have to follow. Jesus has done it all for you. So rejoice. There's so many good qualities about God to rejoice in. Think about those things. And then he moves into let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. So what does that mean? You can kind of take that two ways. So the Lord is near, right? He's coming back soon. He died on a cross. He rose. He went up to heaven again, but he's coming back. He didn't leave us here. This isn't the fulfilled times. This isn't it, right? We know that we're already living in a fallen world. But Jesus is coming back one day, and it's near, right? And then the other way of interpreting that is, of course, proximity. Like God is with you. He has not abandoned you. Jesus has not abandoned you when he went up to heaven. Like he sent the Spirit down to dwell within us. So God is with us, right? When we feel these anxious things, it's so easy to feel isolated, and that's totally normal, right? If we think of it from a fleshly, to use Paul's words, from a fleshly perspective, like it's totally normal to let our thoughts kind of run out of control. And it's so easy to think about the worst case scenario, what ifs, What if this small scenario snowballs into something big? What if this is something out of my control? What if? So if you're watching this, I'm sure you've been down that rabbit trail, right? You get some minor news and you automatically start thinking about worst case scenarios. How am I going to handle this? What do I need to do? And it just runs wild. It totally ruins your day, your week, your month, like whatever, your life. You can let it get to a point where it's ruining your life. So with that in mind, we need to remember that the Lord is near. And then with that, with rejoice, with remembering the Jesus's presence, the indwelling spirit, right? Now we can start to see, do not be anxious about anything. So one, that's Paul's instructions, right? Do not be anxious, but he doesn't stop there. He tells you what to do instead. So rather than being anxious, you fill that mind space with prayer and petition and thanksgiving. So what does that look like? Instead of focusing on the bad, Paul's saying focus on the good. Focus on the good qualities of God, right? Focus on all the things that he has done. Focus on all the times in the past that he has come through for you, right? Think about the things in life that you do have, right? Don't worry about the things that you don't have. Don't worry about the things that you think are lacking. Don't worry about the bad news that you just received, right? God is in control. As much as we want to be in control, we can't be, right? God is the one in control. We can do everything in our ability to live in that humble obedience, right? Think back to chapters 1 and 2. We can do everything within our power to be humbly obedient to God, but ultimately we are trying to just live our life in his will. And that's where the prayer and petition and thanksgiving comes in. So have that conversation with him. Don't just keep those things bottled inside, but give them to him. You apologize for the fear, for the worry, the anxiety, all those things. They are normal, but we want to replace those thoughts with good things, right? And so what Paul says is once we start to do that, and it does take so much practice. Okay, I'm in my 30s, so I've had 30 years essentially of letting worry and anxiety be my first, second, third reactions when I get bad news. And so as you start to retrain your brain, eventually that does become easier and easier and easier and more natural to do when you receive that bad news. But I'm guilty of it just as much as anybody else. When I get bad news, it's not my first instinct. I hope one day it will be, but I'm definitely not at that point yet. But then Paul kind of gives us this reassurance that when we replace the bad with the good, that's when we start to see this otherworldly, this unfathomable peace start to rest on us, and it will guard our hearts and our minds, right? So think about what that meant to them, right? The heart and mind was kind of like yourself, your inner self. So God protects that. God protects all of that. It's not to say that bad physical things don't happen, because clearly they do. But we can rest in knowing that, we are guaranteed salvation as long as we're putting our faith in Jesus. And to dive into it again, that's what Paul's talking about, where he says that everything apart from God, I consider it a loss. The only thing that I consider a gain is living my life for him. It's living a life that's worthy of him. It's living a life where I'm doing everything I can to pursue God. That's what a true godly life looks like. And Paul put that in there for a reason. It's all the things of the world don't matter. Think about all of the things that come in and try to take our mental space captive. TV, music, video games, social media, the news. Think of all these things that are filled with ungodly messages, right? Violence, whatever else. You can dive into all these things. And Paul even says, what should we think about? Well, things that are true, things that are noble, things that are right, things that are pure, things that are lovely, things that are admirable, excellent, praiseworthy. Those are the things that we need to think about, right? So what does that look like on a practical basis? We're watching what we take in. If I take in garbage, right, I'm only going to get garbage out of me. There is a verse that we're going to look at, Proverbs 4:23 So above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. All right. And so when it talks about heart, again, that's that inner self. Guard yourself. Everything that you take in is going to affect your heart. And when your heart's affected, that affects what comes out of you. So if you are constantly feeling anger, see what you're taking in. If you're constantly feeling anxiety, see what you're taking in. If you're constantly feeling, sadness, like watch what you're taking in. And Paul says that as we practice these things, we're going to see this peace kind of start to change the way our mind works. And this peace will kind of, just rest on us. All right. So to tie it all into Emily's teachings, right? The 5 F's. If we think about fear, focus, fixing, fighting, and frustration, those 5 F's, those 5 things that we're told not to do, right? The more we 5F, the more we sensitize our nervous system. If you think about it, those 5 F's are all ways of having anxious thoughts. We're fearful of our situation. We're fearful of what may happen. We're fearful of our health, right? We focus on those things. We don't focus on, the true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy things, but instead we focus on the bad. As we try to fix those things, again, it's not relying on God's timing and God's will. It's thinking that we have to have all of the answers and it has to be on our timeline. Guys, your recovery is not on your timeline. Unfortunately, it's just not. You can control certain aspects of it. You can control the way that you think, but you can't control the desensitized nervous system. It's going to happen at its own pace. And the part that you can control is making sure that you change the thought processes, making sure that you're practicing ideal, making sure that you're not doing the 5 F's. But outside of that, the rest is in God's hands. And we're just kind of along for the ride. Somewhat that's frustrating, sure, but it's also kind of a relief. The pressure's off you. You need to respond correctly. You need to do the right things. But outside of the actual desensitization, you're just along for the ride, and you're trusting that you're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days. You make the most of whatever you're given that day. And then of course the fighting and frustration, that's pushing back. It's pushing back on everything that, you think you're feeling and you want to be in a certain state, but He's got you in the season for a reason. It may be a short season, it may be a long season, but you can't try to fight it. You can't try to get frustrated with where you're at. Again, it's just being appreciative of every single day, every single minute. Really focusing on, like verse 8 says, focusing on those good things. And then eventually your nervous system will desensitize. If you are responding correctly, if you have ideal, if you're not doing the 5 F's, your nervous system will desensitize, and it's just finding that peace in that. Eventually it will happen, right? What we really need to do is just grasp our lack of control. It's not up to us. It's not about, how quickly can I recover? If I do everything perfectly, then I'll be recovered by this date 3 months from now, right? Don't set timelines for yourself. It just puts too much pressure. It puts too much frustration into the equation, and it doesn't have to be, right? We just want to live our life in that humble obedience to God. And as we do that, we'll start to change the way our brains are working. And really, you'll feel a new sense of peace. All right, so as we close this, hopefully this video was helpful to you. This is a new series that we're trying to do where we really just dive into the Bible. We look at some verses, we look at some teaching from Scripture and see how we can apply it to our recovery journey. With this one, hopefully you have a little bit better grasp on when it says, do not be anxious. Those good meaning people in your life that just say, don't be anxious. Just don't be anxious. The Bible tells us don't be anxious. Well, hopefully you know how we can do that. Right? It comes from this process. We rejoice, we have prayer, we have petition, we have thanksgiving, we focus on good things in life. And with all of that, that's going to replace that anxiety, those anxious thoughts that we're feeling. Again, remember, just one more time, I know we said at the top of this video, there are 2 different kind of steps here. You've got the mental aspect of anxiety. This is what the verse is speaking to. It's that mental piece. And then the physical piece will stem from that. So as we kind of fix that mental aspect of anxiety, the physical healing will come. Your nervous system will desensitize. We just got to make sure we're following the ideal method of recovery. We're not doing those 5 F's, right? We're not fearful. We're not focusing. We're not fixing. We're not fighting. We're not frustrated with where our recovery is. We're just trusting God. We're trusting His timing. Guys, I know it's easier said than done. It does take a lot of practice, but we want to hear from you. So let us know in the comments. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you think it's possible to just not be anxious about anything like the Bible teaches us. Let us know where you're having difficulties and kind of making that be true in your life. And let us know some other verses that you want to see. So we've got kind of a list on our end, but if there's anything that's standing out to you, definitely let us know those verses you want to dig into. It doesn't have to be one specific verse. Maybe it's a concept or a topic you want to dive into. But yeah, we just really want to connect recovery with the Bible. God and Jesus and Paul and all the other authors of the Bible, they gave us these awesome teachings. And sometimes we try to disconnect, anxiety and recovery from all of that instruction. And what we want to do here is just find a way to kind of bring those two together. So I hope this video was helpful for you. Keep an eye out for some more. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, and that way you see the new videos as they come out. Emily has a ton of new stuff planned for you. She's got some more recovery videos coming soon. So you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and we will chat with you soon.